as if I've been skirting around the question of character development in visual art a little bit, but now I want to go right to the heart of it with some unfamiliar and then some probably very familiar characters to many of you. We saw a work by Honoré Daumier, Third Class Carriage, when we were looking at the relationship between direct observation from life and the study and the categorizing and the production of types. In that particular case, working class types of people in Paris in the 19th century. Now we're going to look at Daumier being a little bit more explicitly a caricaturist, and this is perhaps one of the most well-known caricatures in French history. It's a marvelous work of punning in French, and you can see Daumier working it out in this series of 4 different representations of King Louis-Philippe of France, and the title is Les Poires. And we see at first a pretty, not quite flattering, but probably somewhat faithful representation of Louis-Philippe as a kind of jowly, middle-aged monarch. And as we move from quadrant to quadrant, we watch Daumier gradually exaggerate those characteristics, bringing the curls up to the point of his head, making the jowly cheeks even jowlier and saggier, eliminating detail until finally King Louis-Philippe is turned into a pear. And in fact, poire, le poire in French means pear, but it also is slang for fathead. So in fact, Daumier finds an accidental likeness between the king and a pear and makes it into a really direct and yet really funny statement of anti-royalist sentiment. That convention of transforming humans into non-humans, of giving types exaggerated and artificial features is very much a part of the tradition of political satire in the 19th and 20th century. And here we're looking at a work by George Grosz, Republican Automatons from 1920. George Grosz was a German artist who intentionally Americanized his name in part out of his dissatisfactions with the state of Germany at the time between the wars. He was part of a group of artists who worked together under the sort of manifesto of Die neue Sachlichkeit, that is to say, a new objectivity or a new matter-of-factness. So on the one hand, you would think that a new objectivity would look more illusionistic and more real, and instead the new objectivity is a way of rejecting the illusionistic realism of a country that's telling itself fairy tales about how its economy is going, how its politics are going, and instead insisting upon a kind of conceptual matter-of-factness, a kind of way of representing the facts of the world as they are, and not the illusions of that world as it wants to believe itself to be. So we see a kind of expose of the hollowness of pro forma patriotism. An automaton waves a flag even as he is revealed to be an amputee, probably a sort of survivor of World War I. The minister figure with his medal prominently displayed is revealed as being a kind of robotic figure that's being driven by an external clockwork and spouting kind of figures and phrases out the top of his hollow head. So a more caricatural representation and a more explicitly imagined world that at the same time is supposed to comment unflinchingly on current realities. In a somewhat different way, Hannah Hoch, a German collage artist, will comment ironically on notions of mass-produced beauty and consumer culture in many of her works. Hoch takes all of the familiar images of car culture, automobile culture in the 1920s, BMW logos, a roadster's wheel, and paste them together with all the familiar attributes of the modern woman, spread out in such a way as we don't know sort of where one body ends and another begins, or how to measure the scale relationships between objects, but we have an overall sense of this kind of alarmingly mechanistically produced version of female beauty that straddles sort of the mechanistic understanding of robots in the early part of the 20th century and what we might understand as cyborg culture in the late 20th and early 21st century. So that when we turn to popular culture in the 1930s and we're looking at a still from the animated cartoon by the Fleischer brothers, Minnie the Moocher, that you're going to hear animation artist Kirsten Lepore talk about later in this course, we can see the way that Betty Boop's father, who has been scolding her about not eating her Hassenpfeffer for dinner, has been transformed into a gramophone-headed beast. Much of caricature production in the early part of the 20th century was framed by the two world wars that set nation against nation and people against people. And so a lot of these devices of exaggeration were used to make one's enemies seem more evil and one's friends seem more friendly. So you can look through comic book culture, especially around World War II, and see American comic books turning Japanese soldiers into even more diabolical and evil beings, and at the same time German culture turning American soldiers into even more evil and diabolical beings. And so comic books become a very crucial place where people work out their anxieties about the instability of contemporary times. We're looking here at a double-page spread from Osamu Tezuka's Astro Boy from 1952 to 1968. This comic book was in production, and it really is an artistic taking over by a Japanese artist of the conventions of Disney animation as a way of creating a believable animated world. So the rounded features of Astro Boy, his big eyes, the ways in which these worlds are created are very much a kind of counter conversation about those Disney conventions. So on the one hand, we can see a Japanese artist trying to make sense of the atomic age through the production of a small but resolute superhero. When we turn to the American side of things, we can see comic book artists trying to work out the anxieties of the atomic age in different ways, and perhaps one of the most interesting and complicated examples is that of Spider-Man. Interesting and complicated because he's a superhero, but not without a certain amount of reluctance and ambivalence about his lot in life. And so he's both fragile and powerful at the same time. His power comes from an accidental exposure to atomic energy. He is in a lab when an atomic experiment is demonstrated. A spider is unknowingly caught up in that atomic experiment, and the spider then bites Peter, who then finds he has kind of extraordinary spider-like powers. And so we might ask ourselves, what is it that makes the ostensibly youth culture of comic books and the ostensibly childish world of animated films so productive a site for working out conditions of contemporary anxiety about everyday life and the sense of a historical consciousness about one's place in the world? And I think it's precisely the ability of these characters to wear their feelings and emotions and anxieties on their sleeves, to externalize them on their bodies, and then also to develop almost extra-human ways of coping with those anxieties that make them a very powerful mythological site of production for telling ourselves comforting stories in uncertain times.